Thanks, guys. It is good to be with you. I want to start with a Bible verse this morning. Bible verse is Proverbs 10:22, which says this. It says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow to it." What you find from this verse is that God's blessing is something that enriches your life. Now, as it turns out, some of the greatest things that enrich our lives are some of the things we notice least. But we're so used to them, we accept what they are, they're around us, we don't really notice them. And I really learned this from a man named Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush is one of our founding fathers, signer of the Declarations. As a matter of fact, John Adams said he's one of the three most notable founding fathers, and you'll never find him in a history textbook. And that's because he doesn't really fit the image of what we're trying to make our history look like today. Man, we say the founding fathers, a bunch of atheists, agnostics, and deists, and well, he doesn't quite fit that because he's the guy who started the Sunday school movement in America. He's the guy who started the first Bible Society in America. He's a very outspoken evangelical. Of course, our founding fathers, a bunch of racists and bigots and slave owners, and he doesn't quite fit that because he started the first Abolition Society in America, led the National Abolition Movement in America, actually helped start the first black denomination and trained the first black physicians. So he didn't, well, of course they were sexist. Well, except he started the first academic education for women in America. He didn't fit anything that we're trying to make our history look like today, so we don't talk about him. And as a result, we miss a lot of the wisdom he had. I'm going to use him a couple times throughout, so let me just go ahead and tell you about him. He signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution, served in 3 different presidential administrations. He's considered one of the top 3 educators in American history. He started 5 universities, 3 of them still go today. In addition to all the other things I mentioned, he also started the first faith-based prison reform in America. He is the most famous physician in American history. Today, we still call him the father of American medicine. He came up with medical cures 200 years ago. We still use today. 3,000 medical students got their diploma with his signature on it. He's the first professor of chemistry in the United States, wrote the first chemistry textbook, did the first psychiatry textbook. It's unbelievable what the guy did. I mean, one guy, just unbelievable what he did. Having said that, as a very strong Christian, by the way, we're very blessed in our organization. We own about 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I own thousands of documents of George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, thousands of documents of America's black history and of church history and of military history and whatever. And among those documents we own, I have many handwritten documents of Benjamin Rush, including his prayer journals. Really cool as he's reading through the Bible and the Lord shows him something in the Scriptures, he'll write it out and write it down. And going through and looking at his writings, he is a guy who tries to be very grateful for the blessings God has given him. And so as he's listing his blessings, I was reading the list, he goes through, he said this, he said, "I thank God for all the times I have not fallen downstairs." What? But see, I just came up the stairs and I didn't fall and nobody noticed that. Now if I'd fallen, everybody would have noticed that. But the blessing was I didn't fall. And see, we didn't notice that. It's like when you go driving, if you get back home and didn't have a wreck, you don't think about it. If you had a wreck, you think about it. The blessing was you didn't have a wreck. And the things that we don't notice are some of the greatest blessings we have. We have health and strength, and we don't notice that until we lose health and strength. And we got great stability, and we don't notice that until we and so all the stuff that we don't notice is really some of the greatest blessings. And so he was remarkable in that he noticed the things that nobody noticed, and those were the great blessings. And it's been that way with us as Americans in our country. I mean, we live in a very blessed nation. The government under which we conduct ourselves is unlike any other in the world, but we really don't understand that. We have a lot of criticism from professors and university and media folks about we got to be like the rest of the world. We got to be like Europe, except I don't think I want to be like the rest of the world. There's 195 nations in the world right now, and when you look at America versus the others, we still have our first form of government. Matter of fact, we've had one constitution since 1789. Imagine what it's like to live in these other governments who've had this many constitutions in that period of time. Can you imagine living in the rest of the world where they seem to average a new constitution, new government every decade, every generation or so? If you are a baby boomer and you live in South Korea, you've had 6 constitutions in your lifetime. If you're 95 years old today and you live in Poland, you have lived through 7 constitutions. I mean, we just never think about that. We have so much stability, we just think it's normal. What we have is not normal. Jesus said there'd be wars and rumors of wars. It was that way when we left. It'll be that way till he gets back, except we've had something different. That's a blessing. Another thing we've had different is the creativity we enjoy. When you look at the technology we have in America now, we're not a big nation. We're 4% of the world's population. But when you measure every year the inventions, the medical cures, the discovery, the technology, when you look at the novels written, the patents filed, the copyrights filed, the symphonies done, You look at everything that indicates creativity in the world, our 4% of the world every year produces more than the other 96% of the world combined. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever, but not true in America. Our 4% produces more. And see, we're so surrounded by all these blessings of life, we don't even think that we're different from other nations, and we are. I mean, what we enjoy here is unbelievable compared to anybody else. And the same when you look even at our economics, because our 4% of the world's population, we produce 25% of the world's gross domestic product. And we don't produce more because we have more. We literally don't. I'm a cowboy. I'm from Texas. I'm in the ranching stuff. And so farmers and ranchers, agricultural people, represent only 1% of America's GDP. And yet our 1% produces enough food to feed the entire world, but America is only 66 in the world with percentage of farmable land. There's 65 nations who have greater percentage of farmable land than we do, but we take our 1% and we're 66 and we produce enough to feed the entire, that's unbelievable. How do we do that? See, these are blessings that we've enjoyed, and there's so many others we can go through. And again, we live at a time in America right now where education is attacking America, and we're bad. We had a debate with on Facebook the other day with a professor from University of Arizona. He said, there's nothing bad in the world but what came out of America. Really? I actually don't think America existed when the Roman Empire fell, so I don't think they can blame us for that. I mean, he blames us for everything. And I find that I speak at universities and law schools across the nation. And the negativism that we're putting in is very profound. Now, with all this that we have, we've always been seen as a different nation. And people outside this country see us as a different. Do you know that if the World Bank sets the world standard for poverty, and they say that if you make $1.25 a day, you live in poverty. If you're in an industrial nation like America, if you make $2 a day, you live in poverty. $2 a day is $730 a year. In America, now that's the global standard for poverty by the World Bank. In America, we say if you make less than $44,000 a year, you live in poverty. So the world standard for poverty is $700, $730. Our standard is $44,000. Do you understand how big a difference that is for everybody else in the world? See, that's why everybody in the world wants to come to America and live in poverty. If they can just be in poverty here, they've elevated their lifestyle. I mean, it's unbelievable the blessings we have. Well, long ago, a man named Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, and he got to America. He ended up writing the book Democracy in America, and the comment he made was, the condition of the Americans is exceptional. I don't think any other nation will attain to what they have. And that's where we get the phrase American exceptionalism. It came out of that book by Alexis de Tocqueville. So American exceptionalism that we enjoy, strikingly, if you'd gone to school before World War II, you would have been told in textbooks, and we collect textbooks from across all generations. I've been appointed by a number of governors and state boards of education to do history and government standards in those states. So I see the textbooks, and so we collect textbooks. And if you'd been in school in America prior to World War II, your textbooks openly told you that the thing that has made America different from all the other nations is the Bible. All this advancement we've enjoyed, all the technology, is because of the Bible. Now, there's no way you're going to hear that in school today. As a matter of fact, we say exactly the opposite, that we're great because we've always been secular, etc. But that's not the case. But even with where we are today, I can still prove the Bible has had a substantial and continues to have a substantial impact on us. Just the way we talk to each other is a great example. Do you know there's 257 idioms or 257 phrases that we use on a daily basis that are nothing more than us quoting the Bible to each other? You'll recognize everyone. They're all Bible verses. By the skin of your teeth, I'll give you my 2 cents worth. Leopard can't change his spots. There's nothing new under the sun. Signs of the time, thorn in the flesh, from the cradle to the grave, handwriting on the wall, a fly in the ointment. 257 phrases we use on a daily basis. We're quoting the Bible to each other. Now, most people don't know that. And matter of fact, next time you're at, I don't know, Walmart, or you go to McDonald's, or you go to Home Depot, or whatever, you're going to hear somebody use one of those 257 Bible verses. I mean, I have a collection now. When I hear somebody use one of these on TV or radio, I send it to the office. I cannot tell you how often ESPN quotes the Bible. I mean, those guys quote the Bible. They don't have a clue they're quoting the Bible, but they quote the Bible all the time. So next time you're at, I don't know, Walmart or wherever, and you hear somebody use one of these phrases, you ought to stop them and say, do you know what Bible verse you just quoted? Now, they're going to look at you and say, no, I don't. And they're going to say, what Bible verse was that? And we won't have a clue either. I mean, we don't know where it came from. So here's the addresses for all these Bible verses. They all have a home. 257, and this shaped the way we talk to one another. But where we are today, I think, is very accurately described by President John Quincy Adams, who said this. He said, with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it's not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. In other words, where we are today, if you had known the Bible, we would have praised you for your Bible knowledge. Back in their day, they would have said, whoa, time out. You didn't know that was out of the Bible? How can you call yourself an educated person and not be familiar with the greatest book in the history of the world? See, for them, it was shameful not to know it. For us, it's become praiseworthy to know it. And you have President Teddy Roosevelt. And by the way, for the next few minutes, I'm going to use presidents of the United States. I do that deliberately because you expect me to say something good about the Bible and church. You expect Drew to say something good about the Bible and church. What you don't expect is that for 150 years, it was the presidents of the United States who kept telling the American people how important the Bible was and how we couldn't be a good nation without it. It was the political leaders. It's our chief. Yes, it was. Teddy Roosevelt said this. Teddy Roosevelt said, the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and so entwined with our civic and social life. Notice he did not say spiritual life. That's what we would have said. He said, no, we know the spiritual life. He said the Bible is so much a part of our civic and our social life that it would be impossible for us to figure what life would be if these teachings were removed. If you take out of America what the Bible produced, you wouldn't even recognize this country. Like what? Well, that economic prosperity we were talking about, more so than any other nation in the world, that's a result of the American free market economic system. And our free market economic system was formed almost 100 years before the rest of the world got their free market economic system. Our free market economic system, you study history, which we used to know, you find out that the free market economic system in America was built on 5 specific Bible verses. 1 Timothy 5:8, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Matthew 25, Luke 19, Matthew 20. That's the free market economic system in America. Now, if you take the free market economic system out of America, you would never recognize this country. If our economy was not the way it is, you wouldn't know it. And as bad as it is, we're still better than the rest of the world by a long shot. But see, the Bible produced that, and people don't recognize that. But if you take it out, they would say, that's not America. Same with our form of government. The Bible shows 7 different forms of government. And the form of government that we chose in America was what the Bible recommended in Exodus 18:21, in Deuteronomy 16:18, and Deuteronomy 1:15 and 16. In those passages, it says, choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Have elections, and elect local, county, state, and federal officials, which is what we've done from the beginning. You see, when those folks got to America in 1620, they weren't having elections in Europe, but they set them up in America, and they used that Bible verse. Their pastor, John Robinson, said, when you get to America, do not follow the pagan customs of the land from which you've left. Start the new customs that you find in the Bible. Elect your leaders. So that's where we started what we now call a Republican form of government. It's not Republican Party, it's not big R, it's small r. A Republican form of government means you elect leaders to represent you. That's what the Bible recommended and preferred. If you took that out of America, if we weren't electing our leaders at local, county, state, and federal level, we wouldn't recognize America. It came out of the Bible, but very few know that today. Here's another president. President Franklin Roosevelt said this. He said, in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised on the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. Today it's conspicuously absent. I mean, all founding fathers, a bunch of atheists, agnostics. We actually have Christian schools now teaching kids in Christian school that the Pilgrims were secular. They did not believe in God. They came to America looking for gold, not religious liberty. Now, for you older folks, you ought to be saying, what? For younger folks, you may not know that every bit of that is false. But that's what we're now being, even in Christian schools, we're being taught that. So the fact that the Bible exercised a conspicuous influence on the fathers is evident? No, it's not evident today. But he continued. He said, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. Every time in history you find something going right in America or advancing, it's because we were obeying the Bible. If it's going wrong and not doing right, it's because we weren't obeying the Bible. I mean, it was real simple stuff. Give you an example. He said it was conspicuously evident in our fathers. Well, you can't say that about Ben Franklin because he's one of the least religious founding fathers. Out of 250 founding fathers, this is a founding father you will definitely be exposed to in school because he's one of the 5 least religious. Okay, but Franklin's also an interesting character for many reasons, not the least of which is he's the first guy in our history to call for having the United States of America. Way back in 1754, 22 years before the American Revolution, he said, guys, let's not be 13 nations, let's be one United States. Well, they weren't ready for it back then, but 22 years later, he's one of the 56 guys who signed the Declaration of Independence that said, hey, let's be an independent nation. 7 years after that, he's one of only 3 guys who signed the peace treaty to secure America as an independent nation. And then 4 years after that, he's sitting at the Constitutional Convention helping birth the United States of America. This is what he's dreamed about for 33 years. Now, here's Franklin right here, and he is 81 years old at this point in his life, and he is by far the elder statesman of the convention. You see the white hair he's got. Now, 81 years old is not particularly impressive to us today because 80 is the average lifespan in America now. Yeah, but do you know what the average lifespan was when they signed the Constitution? Average lifespan was 33 years old, which means if you're 17 years old and you're here this morning and you had been alive back then, you would have already had your midlife crisis. Because, I mean, once you hit 17, you're more than half done. It's downhill from there. He's 81 years old, and he loved the fact that we're building the United States of America. At least he loved it initially. It wasn't going according to plan. Because, you see, 5 weeks into the Constitutional Convention, it was all falling apart. They were fighting and bickering. What happened was everybody came with their own state agenda. You had the Virginia plan, the Connecticut plan, the New York plan, the New Jersey plan. New Jersey guys didn't want the Virginia plan. Virginia guys didn't want Connecticut plan. Connecticut guys didn't want the New York plan. So everybody came with their own agenda. And so what happens is 5 weeks into this, there's been so much fighting, so much bickering, that Alexander Hamilton, he's going back to New York. He's had it with all the fighting, got better things to do. George Mason, Virginia, he's out of there. He's got better things to do. So it's falling apart. Franklin's watching his dream of 33 years fall apart in front of his eyes. And so on Thursday, June the 28th, 1787, he gave the longest speech he gave at the Constitutional Convention. I want you to see part of what he said. This is what Franklin said. He said, gentlemen, he said, in this situation of this assembly, groping, as it were, in the dark to find political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we've not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of light to illuminate our understanding? He said, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. And a little time out here, this is the exact room in which 11 years earlier they signed the Declaration. He said, guys, don't you remember what we used to do in this room? We prayed all the time. As a matter of fact, you'll find that by 1815, they had issued 1,400 government-issued calls to prayer in America. Wow. Government called us to prayer on 1,400 occasions by 1815? Yeah. We were really into praying, and the government made sure that we were calling people to pray. Franklin said, guys, don't you remember what we used to do in this room? He said, our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. He said, all of us engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. He said, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We've been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. He said, I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and his blessings on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, may I point out that's not bad for your least religious founding father? He has just chewed out everybody else for not praying enough. Now, he is the least religious of that group, but the least religious, that's the way textbooks portray him, not by a long shot, but nonetheless, that little speech you just saw of Franklin, that speech you just witnessed there was 14 sentences long. Now, here's the question I've got. 14 sentences. How many Bible verses did you see Ben Franklin quote in those 14 sentences? The proper answer is 14 Bible verses. This is what Ben Franklin just quoted in his speech. Now, if you recognize those Bible verses, we'll be praising you. I can't believe you saw it. But you see, back in their day, even the least religious founding father knew the Bible that well. Man, what a change that is, that the least religious quotes 14 Bible verses in 14 sentences. And see, notice too, he didn't ever identify he was quoting the Bible verse, because we knew the Bible well enough back then that we didn't need to tell you we're quoting the Bible. We recognized it when it was quoted. Today we have to say, now, quoting to you from John 3:16, you know, Job 3:25 says, and over here in Isaiah 55, 7 and 8, we have to say we're quoting the Bible, otherwise nobody recognizes it. Back in their day, even the least religious knew the Bible that well, and we didn't feel like we had to tell you we were quoting it, because we read it in school every year. I mean, that's what we start in school with, and it's significant. To give you the rest of the story on this, after Franklin made that call to prayer, The records convention indicate they took 3 days off, kind of like a cooling off period. Let's back away from this. Let's let things simmer down. George Washington said that they went to church where they listened to patriotic orations, and while they were at church, the Reverend William Rogers had prayer over the Constitutional Convention. And it was not a dinky prayer like we would give today over a school board, over city council. No, it was a serious time of prayer. As a matter of fact, I've got the original prayer he prayed. And at that time in Philadelphia, everybody in Philadelphia knew this thing is falling apart because people are leaving town. So he's got the Constitutional Convention right there in front of him in church, and he prays over them. And his prayer was so significant, they printed it on the front page of the newspapers. And that prayer, again, not dinky, that prayer took up 3/4 of the front page of the newspaper. It was a serious time of prayer they had at the Constitutional Convention there in church. So after 3 days, when they get back together, they've now had 3 days off. They've gone to church together. They've listened to patriotic orations. They've had special prayer. When they get back, delegates like Jonathan Dayton said the whole atmosphere had shifted. There was something different. It was a really stupid idea last week, but that idea is not that bad after all. And so there was a change that went forth. And as a result, only 10 weeks later, they came out with a document in which we now govern ourselves. It's the most successful constitution in the history of the world. It went from the point of dismal failure to the point of absolute, unbelievable success. And if you know the Bible, and if you read the Constitution, you find Bible verses all throughout the Constitution. But today, we have professors like Cramnick Moore at Cornell University who have the book called The Godless Constitution, use that in courts. And that book says, oh, no, these guys, it was a godless document. These guys were sick. You know, when somebody today tells me the Constitution is a secular document or that it's a godless document, what they've actually done is they've actually just told me that they are biblically illiterate. They wouldn't recognize a Bible verse if it bit them on the ankle, because there's Bible verses all over there, but they just don't see it because the Founding Fathers didn't feel like they had compelled to tell you they were quoting the Bible. We knew they were quoting the Bible back then. So we don't have that secular document, and the history is so clear that even some of our least religious presidents, like Andrew Jackson, it was even a no-brainer for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson said the Bible is the rock on which our republic rests. And you have President Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor was a war hero. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready. Look what Zachary Taylor said. Zachary Taylor said, the Bible is the best of books. I wish it were in the hands of everyone. It's indispensable to the safety and permanence of our institutions. There it is again. He didn't say our faith. He said our institution. What do you mean? Well, I've already shown you with the free market system, Republican form of government. Let me give you another example. I've been involved in 7 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court, and Justice Stephen Breyer, one of the very secular judges on the court, not religious in any way, shape, fashion, or form, even he said, well, of course we all know that all the clauses in the 4th through 8th Amendment, the due process clauses, they all come out of the Bible. Oh, really? We all know that? Are you kidding? Well, for example, the right to confront your accuser comes out of John 8:12. The right to compel witnesses in your behalf comes out of Proverbs 18:17. I mean, we used to know that all of our institutions, they were built on the Bible. So he says the safety and permanence of our institutions depend on the Bible, which means the more secular those institutions become, the less well they operate. Notice the judiciary. The more secular they become, less well they operate. Government, the more secular it becomes, less well it operates. Education, the more secular it becomes, less well it operates. I mean, just an example of education, because I'm an educator, $164,000 is what we spend of tax dollars to put a child through 12 years of public education. $164,000, and boy, do we love education. We spend $460 billion every year on education. $164,000 per student from 12 years of school, and right now, over the last 15 years, 19% of all the graduates we graduate are 100% illiterate. They cannot even read their own diploma. America used to be number 1 in the world in literacy. We're now number 62 in the world in literacy. We get our socks beat off by third world nations. See, the more secular we become, the less effective, the less, as he said, the less safe and permanent our institutions are. So this is what we knew, and he continued. He said, especially should the Bible be placed in the hands of the young, it is the best school book in the world. I would that all of our people were brought up under the influence of that holy book. Now notice that best school book in the world. He can't say that. That's unconstitutional. Which is the irony that for us to do what was done for centuries in America today is unconstitutional. We haven't changed the Constitution. We haven't added new amendments to alter this. How come it was okay then and not okay now? And the answer is because we don't know our own history. Go back to Dr. Benjamin Rush. I told you all the things he did. I told you he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. What happened was, after signing the Declaration, ratifying the Constitution, now the nation is in operation, the Constitution is in effect, he said, you know, We used to be 13 nations, and each one had their own education system. Now we're one nation. What are we going to have to teach in schools if we're going to be a unified nation? And so on March the 10th, 1791, he came out with the answer. And the answer was, we teach the Bible in schools. He gave a dozen reasons we would never, ever take the Bible out of public schools. Now, that's the father of public schools, saying the only way we stay a strong nation is to teach the Bible in public schools. And there are so many other founders I could show you that said the same thing. And as a result, that's why in 1844, in the case of Vidal versus Girard's executors, U.S. Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, said, if you're going to be a government-run, government-operated school, you will teach the Bible. We will not fund any public school that won't teach the Bible. Really? How many of us got that decision in our history books at school? See, we don't get that. What we get is modern history. And that starts in 1963 in the case Abbott and Shemp and Murray Curlett. The U.S. Supreme Court said, oh, you know this deal about teaching the Bible in schools? We're not going to do that anymore. And so the court that made that decision, actually, they themselves said in the decision that taking the Bible out of American public schools was without either historical or legal precedent. Wait a minute, if there's no historical or legal basis, why are you doing it? If you want to know, read the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. All the cases I've been involved with, we want to know what they did. We read the decision. And if you read the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court on the Abbott and Shemp case, this is what the court says. It says, if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. We've now discovered the Bible causes brain damage. We've got to save our kids from brain damage. Are you kidding me? Think how much brain damage we've suffered since we've taken it out. I mean, we used to be able to recognize that there's 2 genders. Today, there's 82 genders. I bet you didn't know that. Even Facebook has over 60 genders now. The Bible says God made them male and female. No, no, no. We got so much brain damage, we can't even recognize the obvious anymore. We don't even know right from left, up from down. I mean, it's crazy. But no, we have to save our kids from brain damage. So the result of that was predicted by Benjamin Rush, that piece he did in 1791. This is what he said. He said, the Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. We now know that statistically. I work with a lot of polling folks and George Barna and others, and we know that the sooner you start reading the Bible, the more likely you are to read it throughout your life. Later in life it is, the harder it is to start, and the less likely you'll keep going throughout life. It takes a lot more effort. You can still do it, but when you're older, it takes a lot. So we used to start kids in school reading the Bible. That's how you learn to read, is out of the Bible when you're 4 and 5 and 6. But if you wait till they're in junior high or high school, it's hard to get them started. If you wait till they're in college, it's a lot harder to get them started. If you wait till they're out of college in the middle of their career, it's even hard. So that's what he said. And that's what's resulted in the biblical illiteracy that we have today. That's why we can't recognize so many Bible verses, because we didn't start when we were back here, and it's so much harder to start as we go through here. But the Bible does apply to every aspect of life. As a matter of fact, every one of these issues that's popping up before you has been in the news in the last 12 months, and the Bible specifically addresses everyone. Wait a minute, where's the Bible talk about minimum wage? Well, it does, and actually it talks about capital gains taxes. It talks about estate taxes. It talks about progressive taxes, capitation taxes. Actually, even at the bottom right, rights of conscience. Rights of conscience are huge. Think about the fights we're having now with bakers and with photographers and with florists who don't want to participate in gay weddings, and Hobby Lobby and the Little Sisters of the Poor who don't want to be forced to pay for abortions. Rights of conscience, and Christians are really torn on that. You know, you need to follow what the civil government says. Time out. There's 30 verses in the New Testament alone that tell you to preserve the rights of conscience. 4 verses in the New Testament tell you to craft your public policies to protect the rights of conscience. So we're having a discussion. We had 7 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court last session on whether the rights of conscience should be protected. That shouldn't be an issue for Christians. We should be able to cite the Bible. And so that's what we used to know. Now, the Bible is so practical, and again, going back to Benjamin Rush, this is what Benjamin Rush said. He said, the Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any other book in the world. God knows everything you need to know about running a nation. By the way, he started a nation. He ran a great successful nation called Israel. He gave them 613 laws in their civil government. It covered restitution. It covered criminal justice. It covered immigration. It covered military. It covered economics. You name the issue. God knew what a nation needed. He gave them 613 laws. Healthcare laws, it's all there. So the Bible deals with everything, and he says, the Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any book in the world. I'll give you some examples as we close down. I want to go to Matthew Maury. We used to teach him in all the textbooks. We don't teach him anymore. He's a great guy. He's called the father of oceanography. This is the guy who discovered the jet streams in the ocean. that if you'll get over here about 50 miles, you can get to Europe a week before all the other ships do. And that's big in commercial shipping. And if you want to go from Europe to Africa, get over here in this jet stream. And if you want to go from Africa to Australia, he discovered all these jet streams. Now, here's the deal. He grows up in the founding era listening to the speeches of James Madison and other founders. He grows up in the 1820s, 1830s. And by the way, when he was a little bitty kid, he went to sea as a cabin boy, but he loved the sea and he stayed there. So he then became a sailor, and then he worked his way up to being an officer, and then he worked his way up to being a ship captain, and then he worked his way up to owning the ship, and then he worked his way up to owning a fleet of ships. I mean, he loves the sea. It's where he spent his life. But think about technology in the 1830s and 1840s. No satellites. How did he figure out where all the jet streams were in the ocean? How do you do that with that kind of technology? You don't have a bird's eye view, and yet he did it. Father of oceanography. And the way he did it, he explained. Now, he was ashore one time, and he had a stagecoach accident that crushed his leg, and his leg never grew back, so he was never able to go back to sea, but he kept studying the sea because that was the love of his life. And he said one time while he was homesick, he was in bed, and he asked his family to read the Bible out loud to him. And so they started reading out loud, and there was a particular passage that jumped at him out of Psalm 8. This is the passage that they were reading. It says, Lord, thou madest man to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatever passes through the paths of the sea. He said, wait a minute, read that again. You see, what jumped out of him was whatever passes through the paths. I've never seen paths. I've been on the sea my whole life. I've never seen a path in the sea. Read that again. Paths of the sea. I've seen paths in the ocean. I've seen paths in forests and paths over the hills. Read that again. And he had him just kept reading that over and over. He said, if God says there's pathways in the ocean, there's pathways in the ocean. I got to find them. And that's how he found out that there were pathways in the ocean. That's why we call him the father of oceanography. Back then, before we had the technology, he already discovered that. Interestingly, that wasn't the only Bible verse that shaped him or us. Another verse that really got his attention was Ecclesiastes 1:6. The Bible says this, the wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on a circuit. Whoa, the wind has a circuit? South and north. And he learned that, see the way that circuit's going there? You don't want to set sail right now. If you wait till next week, it's going to be great. But if you set sail now, you're going to have serious trouble. See, he's the guy who discovered jet streams in the air as well as jet streams in the ocean. And again, think about doing that back in the 1830s and 40s with technology that was available. But he did that because the Bible said that. And because he did that, for the first time in human history, weather prediction became possible. We could say, see those clouds, don't set sail now, wait till next. So he's called the father of naval meteorology. So weather prediction came out of the Bible? Yeah, absolutely. Because we learned that God, who made all the world, put patterns in it, what are called the laws of nature, back in the book of Job and back in Genesis. And you find out that that's what a scientist is to do, is discover the laws that exist in science and in nature. And God made them all, and he tells us about them. So that's one example. Now, of course, we do this today, and they say, oh, no, science and faith are incompatible. Science and Bible don't get along. Well, he got that same pushback back then. As he reported, I've been blamed by men of science both in this country and in England for quoting the Bible in confirmation of the doctrines of physical geography. By the way, notice he didn't say for quoting the Bible and discovering. He said quoting the Bible and confirmation, because they believed that all truth was God and that the Bible and the science only confirmed what God had done. Even Thomas Paine, the absolute least religious of the founding fathers, said man can invent nothing in science. All they can do is discover the principles the Creator has put there. And he's the least religious founding father. So we believe that all science came from God. And by the way, on top of that, I'm a science guy. I went to college on a math and science scholarship, got out of college, taught math and science in high school, became a school principal. Math and science is my stuff. I love it. And I'll point out to you that some of the greatest scientists we have, like Francis Bacon, who's the father of modern science. He's the guy who came up with inductive reasoning, all the stuff he did. Francis Bacon wrote more on theology than he did on science. Or Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton gave us the laws of gravitation, gave us the laws of motion. The reason we can fly planes is because Newton's second law of motion. He also gave us all the stuff that we do with optics, and Newton wrote more on theology than he did on science. See, the greatest scientists were the guys who spent the most time in the Bible. And that's just the way it had been throughout that period of history. So he continued to say, the Bible, they say, was not written for scientific purposes and is therefore of no authority in matters of science. Exactly what we hear today. But he said, I beg pardon. He said, the Bible is authority for everything it touches. The Bible is true and science is true. They're both true. And when your men of science, with vain and hasty conceit, announce the discovery of disagreement between them, in other words, when scientists say, oh, Bible and science are incompatible, he said, rely on it. The fault is not with the witnesses or his records. It's not God's going to be at fault. He said it's with the worm, the sinful human, who attempts to interpret evidence he does not understand. He said, I guarantee you, science will always come back around to where the Bible is. Now, because I am in science, we also have a daily radio program, heard on about 350 stations, half hour a day. And what we do is about every 2 weeks, I will pull out all these scientific studies that nobody's talking about, because what it is science saying, we're going to have to change direction. We've had it wrong for the last 30 years. And the direction they changed to now is exactly what the Bible had been saying all that time that they had been denying for 30 years. And of course, they don't like publicizing that and talking about it. That's why I love pulling out the studies and saying, look at the most recent study we got here. Guess what? Science is now back in line with the Bible. It took them 30 years to get there, but they're back. See, that's what we knew back then, because God is the greatest scientist in history. My gosh, he created every science that exists. Everything we study is his creation. So we knew that. Here's another example. John Adams. John Adams is a great founding father who had a huge impact on our government, particularly on the constitutional separation of powers. Now, we knew from Isaiah 33:22 where the three branches of government were, what they were. That's where you find three branches of government, Isaiah 33:22. But what we did was said, yeah, we got the three branches. Lots of government do that. But we're going to do checks and balances between the branches and separation of powers. Now, that idea had never before been done in the Constitution. And when political scientists today say that's probably the greatest feature of our Constitution that's given us longevity, is constitutional checks and balances. Where'd that come from? John Adams has several letters where he says, well, we got that out of Jeremiah 17:9. Really? That's a Bible innovation, checks and balances between the branches. And then if you look at our court system today, our court system, James Kent's considered one of the two fathers of American jurisprudence. He's one of the two guys responsible for our court system. And the way they set it up was we had circuit court judges. Folks don't know, but the U.S. Supreme Court was a circuit court. Back in the day, every Supreme Court justice hopped on a horse and rode the circuit on his horse. He was a circuit judge. Today, they still ride the circuit, but now they do it electronically. Every judge has an electronic circuit that they ride. But where did we get this idea of circuit court judges? The father of American jurisprudence said, oh, that came out of 1 Samuel 7, verses 15 and 16. That's where we get circuit court judges. And then you have things like Alexander Hamilton, where he says, well, it's Luke 11:20 is the reason that we have a written constitution. Well, I thought the written constitution was because that's what everybody else did. No. Written constitutions were not at all common back then. As a matter of fact, to this day, Great Britain still does not have a written constitution. We're 200 years of British colony. We came up with a written constitution, which was not that common back then, and they quote Luke 11:20 is the reason. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, so does James Madison. He quotes Luke 11:20 is the reason we have a written constitution. So there's so many more examples of how practical the Bible is, what it's done for us today. If you get interested in this kind of stuff, we have out back what's called the Founder's Bible, which is nothing more than all these writings I'm telling you about, where the founding fathers show you Bible verses for what they did, and it's across the generations as well, civil rights leaders, etc., what the Bible did. So to close this thing down, the issue we have in America today is right here. We just don't know this book very well. See, it's kind of an unknown book. The average family owns 4.4 Bibles, and yet we know last year that only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. So among Christians, only 1 out of 10 reads the Bible daily. But, of course, we all have our favorite books. I love staying in the book of Genesis, or I love the book of John, or whatever your book is. So then the question is asked, okay, how many Christians have ever read the book from cover to cover in their entire lifetime? And the answer is 5% of Christians have ever read the book from cover to cover. So we have 95% of Christians who have never read what's inside the book. And it's pretty hard to live a biblical life if you don't know what the Bible says. We're told in Philippians 2:5-8, let this mind be in you which was in Christ Jesus, which is great. The mind of Christ Jesus is right there in that book. It's all written down. The way God thinks and what he thinks, it's all in that book. So we got to get in that book. And going back to John Quincy Adams, which is where I started, John Quincy Adams wrote so much about the Bible that in 1848 they took his writings on the Bible and put them into a textbook for 10-year-old Americans, showing 10-year-old Americans how to read through the Bible from cover to cover once every year. Now you can imagine what would happen today if a president were to make a book for 10-year-old Americans how to read the Bible cover to cover once a year. But he did. And this is what John Quincy Adams said. He said, no book in the world deserves to be so unceasingly studied and so profoundly meditated on as the Bible. He says, the first and almost the only book deserving such universal recommendation is the Bible. He said, I have myself for many years made it a practice to read through the Bible once every year. And that was common practice because we did it in schools, and these guys always took time. He started every day with 1 hour in the Bible, every day. Now, you got to understand, he was in political life for 70 years. When he's 8 years old, he has musket with the Massachusetts Minutemen back in the American Revolution. When he's 14 years old, he gets his first congressional diplomatic appointment. When he's 15 years old, he gets his second congressional diplomatic appointment. By the age of 21, George Washington said that he's the greatest diplomat we have in the American diplomatic corps. He becomes a U.S. Senator. He becomes a foreign ambassador to 5 different nations. He's appointed and confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court. He turned it down because at the time he was ending the War of 1812 with the Treaty of Ghent. He then becomes Secretary of State. He becomes President of the United States. He spends 17 years in the House of Representatives, 70 years in public life, and every day he starts with an hour in the Bible. Every day he starts an hour in the Bible. Now, I want to challenge you, if you've never read through the Bible from cover to cover, make a commitment that 12 months from now you will have gone through that book cover to cover. And if you've already read it from cover to cover, do it again. But you don't have to spend an hour in the Bible every day like he did. To read the Bible through from cover to cover in a year, you need to read 3.2 chapters. That's about 15 minutes of reading every day. And if you don't want to read it, great. Get YouVersion or something else on your smartphone. And while you're brushing your teeth and combing your hair, let it read it out loud to you. I mean, it's so easy to go through the Bible now. It's not a hard task at all. But he put an hour a day in it. He says, I've myself for many years made it a practice to read the Bible once every year, as did Benjamin Rush and John Jay and Elias Boudinot and Roger Sherman, so many other founding fathers. He says, I've always endeavored to read it with the same spirit which I now recommend to you. 10-year-old kids, listen up to me. I want to tell you how to read the Bible. I recommend you read it exactly the same way I do. He says, I read it with the intention and desire that it may contribute to my advancement in wisdom and virtue. In other words, when I read the Bible, it's not a devotional book. I'm not looking to get blessed. I'm looking to find something specific to apply. I want something that'll change the way I think, my wisdom. I want something that'll change the way I act, my virtue. I'm always looking for specific applications, which is why I find what it does for science and what it does over here in economics and what it does over here in judiciary. We're always looking for specific. He says, read the Bible, always looking for specific application. So that's what I want to challenge you with. If you've never read through the Bible from cover to cover, take that commitment to do it this year. If you've done it before, do what they did, read it through once every year. It will revolutionize your life and the culture. I'll close with this Bible verse. It's a promise that God gives in Joshua 1:8, where God says, constantly think about my word every day and every night, so you'll be sure to obey it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. Notice that prosperity and success follows putting God's word into practice. So you do it. You know it, and you study it, know it, and do it. And you see, that's what made America different from every other nation. We got plenty of warts on our nose. We did lots of things wrong. But every time we got it right, it's because we put the Bible into practice. Remember what President Roosevelt said. All of our advances came from putting the Bible in practice. And the reason we put it in practice more than any other nation in history, except perhaps Israel, we have tried to apply biblical principles, and we tried to apply them in all. That's why we've been different. And the more we get away from those principles, the more we keep sliding, the more we're going to be like Europe and be like the rest of the world, the more instability, the more economic depression. Everything's going the wrong way because prosperity and success comes from putting his principles in practice. So do it in your life, do it in your family life, do it in church life, do it in your business. Let's do it in politics as well, because the only way this country gets back to where it needs to be is by people like us reading the Bible, learning the principles, putting them into practice, implementing that around us. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share.